Thank you. I apparently have a tendency lately to give Ruby-related talks at conferences that are mostly not Ruby people, but that's all right. We'll have some fun. Before we get too far, I actually have a huge favor to ask all of you. Yesterday was GitHub's 5th birthday. Yeah, it's awesome. So 5 years ago, yesterday was when we first launched. And we've had for a while this kind of tendency, or this habit of anytime we launch something or anytime we're celebrating something, we do these cheers or toasts where we'll all post an image of ourselves, celebrating whatever that thing is. And lately, I've been trying to step up my game and make them somewhat more interesting. So like my last one was when we launched this internal tool called Haystack. I was like, oh, I'm gonna do something funny, So anyway, I figured since I was here, I was wondering if you guys could help me get a picture toasting GitHub's 5th birthday. So I wonder if everybody could come up. Would that be too much to ask? And we'll gather right here, and can I get somebody to stand on the stage and take our picture, toasting? So bring your drink up real quick. Would somebody mind taking the picture? I know that means you're not going to be in it, but actually maybe, how about I'll just take your guys' picture? Let's do that. Oh, no, this will be good. This will be good. All right, so everybody scoot in closer. Oh, Ian's got it. All right. Scoot in closer. Hold up your drink. Cheers to GitHub. Cheers. Cheers. Awesome. Thank you so much. Oh, it's beautiful. So I hope that makes it on the internet at some point. I don't know if we're going to post all the toasts or the cheers from the 5th birthday, but anyway. So, hello, I'm Brandon Keepers. Beekeepers everywhere on the internet. That's important. So GitHub and Twitter. I have one of those last name keepers that people kind of like to make jokes about, oh, he's a keeper, or are you keeping your code? Stuff like that, stupid stuff. I also was naive and chose the first initial of my name, Brandon, as part of my Twitter handle. And so people are like, oh, beekeeper, haha, do you keep bees? I do not keep bees. I just want to clarify that right now. You guys have a lot of bees here, though. Everywhere, while I was traveling around this last week, I kept running into honey and bee farms. Anyway, so now that that's out of the way, a little bit more about me. I started my software development career as part of a consulting company called Collective Idea. Was part of that for 5 years. I left and joined Ordered List, where we built a couple of products that you may have heard of or used, speakerdeck.com and Gauges, which is a web analytics app. And then about a year and a half ago, we actually had the opportunity as a team to join with GitHub. And we were all extremely delighted to do that. So I've been at GitHub for about a year and a half now. I've worked on various projects at GitHub, some github.com, all Ruby and JavaScript related. And then recently, again, I've been spending most of my time on SpeakerDeck, which was what we started building at Ordered List. So we have a whole team of people working on that, and there's going to be some pretty exciting things. But as you guys know, GitHub has become somewhat popular. And anytime we travel around, we have people asking us a lot of questions. How do we do things? Some of the decisions that we've made, some of the internal tools and practices that we have. And so I've just kind of started writing some of the common things down. And I thought it'd be fun to give a talk on just some of the frequently asked questions, specifically about Ruby at GitHub. So I'm gonna address a few of those that people ask a lot, and then just open it up and give us time to ask other questions that come to mind. And those can be specifically about Ruby or whatever you want. So here's some of the questions that are common or kind of broad categories. Which languages are used at GitHub? I think everybody knows that we do use Ruby a lot, but that's not the only thing. Where is Ruby not used? Why Ruby? Which libraries in Ruby do we use? And then, not specifically related to Ruby, but how do you handle major system changes. With GitHub being 5 years old now, I think this is probably considered a legacy code base. And so how do we handle updates to github.com and some of our internal tools? So that's updating Ruby, updating Rails, and libraries and so forth. So those are the things we'll look at, and then we'll have some time for your questions. So the first question, which languages are used at GitHub? I cloned all of the repositories on our internal GitHub org. So github.com/GitHub is our organization. github.com/GitHub/GitHub is GitHub, which is a little recursive. But anyway, I cloned all of those. There's 602 repositories that we use internally in some form. As I was looking at them, about 228 were inactive, meaning they hadn't been committed to in 6 months. And so I kind of figured that, well, if we're not committing to them actively, they're probably not a core part of our infrastructure. So I ignored them. 42 of them were forks that we forked from other open source projects. And so I excluded them just because we didn't write most of that code. And so kind of skewed stats a little bit. And then 7 of them I just ignored because they were either full of like random crap or completely irrelevant. Like we had a bunch of like Cisco router configs, which was like the more code than any of the rest of our apps. And so like half of our language, half the language statistics was these Cisco router configs. But anyway, so I ignored them. So I looked at 342 repos to come up with some of these numbers. So quick side note is this is excluding several other parts that are actually core to GitHub. So github.com/libgit2 is an organization that's working on a C version of Git, writing it as a linkable C library. We contribute to that, as does Microsoft and a lot of other people. I excluded that. I excluded Boxen, which is a setup tool we use for our Mac laptops. Several other things. We have a lot of staff that contribute to open source projects, and it'd be really hard to track all those down. So that's not including those. But here's the numbers. Here's internal GitHub projects simply by primary language. So of those 342 repositories, what are they mostly? 58% of them were Ruby, 11% were JavaScript, 8% Objective-C. We have Shell, CoffeeScript, C, and then C#. And then 6% other, which I think there was like 20 or 30 other languages that we had some form of. So as I first looked at that, I thought, that was kind of about what I would have guessed, that 2/3 of our projects were Ruby. But I know based on the people that we have writing code that there's a lot more code that's written that's not Ruby than what that represents. And so I looked at them by primary language, or excuse me, by bytes instead of primary language. And the picture changed a lot. So let me go back and forth between that a few times. So here's by primary language, and there's by bytes. So now, looking at this, we have only 1/3 of our code is Ruby, 15% C now. JavaScript is still up there. We got a lot more Objective-C, CoffeeScript, which could be lumped in with JavaScript, C#, Puppet, Java, and then still 6% other. So I think that this started to tell an interesting story. We could take some guesses as to why these differences are so much. One of them might be that Ruby is just a lot more expressive. You can do more in less Ruby than you can some languages. The inverse might be true. Some languages are really explicit and don't try and make any guesses about what you're doing. C, for example, doesn't do anything for you. You have to be really explicit about what you want to do. So anyway, I just found this really interesting. Like this is the code that we're writing internally. Obviously, from that graph, with only 1/3 of our code being Ruby, I wanted to clarify that a lot of people see GitHub, or people that know us well, often assume that we consider ourselves a Ruby shop. And Ryan Tomeko says it this way: we're not a Rails shop, we're not a Ruby shop. If anything, we're a Unix shop. And so what I mean by that is, if we have an allegiance to any core technology, we really see ourselves coming out of Unix in terms of we find our value in taking all of these small pieces and combining them together into something more useful, kind of the core Unix philosophy of write a bunch of small things that pipe together. And that even bleeds over into the way that we work together as a team, kind of our philosophy about managing people. So and this is not really related to Ruby or languages, but one of the things at GitHub is that everybody essentially has sudo access. There's nothing that I couldn't, that I can't do that someone else can. It's a very loose organization based on trust, and if you violate that trust, then then there's other issues. But anyway, I can talk more about that if you want to ask more questions about that in the Q&A. So the next question: where is Ruby not used? 2/3 of our code is not Ruby. The biggest category of that is obviously native. We have GitHub for Mac, which is our GUI client that runs on the Mac. Most of that's written, that's entirely written in Objective-C. We have GitHub for Windows, which Paul, who's talking the closing keynote today, works on that. But that one is obviously mostly written in C#. We have a couple Android apps. So we have a github.com Android app that allows you to browse repositories and issues and stuff like that. It's written in Java, which, if you remember back to that graph, actually, I'll skip back to it quickly. If we look at by primary language, Java doesn't even show up. It's not until we look at by bytes that we see a little bit of Java at 2%. I thought this was really interesting, so I looked a little bit more into why that was the case. And my guess is that one of the reasons is most of all of our Android stuff is open source. So both the clients that we maintain are open source, and then a lot of the libraries that compose those are also separate open source projects. And so there's not a lot of code in the Android app itself. Most of that's pulled out into these other libraries. So anyway, a little aside on that. We have numerous iOS apps. We have a couple in the App Store that are public, and then several internal apps for just helping manage our team and communicating. And those are all written in Objective-C as well. We have Hubot. Has anyone used Hubot? Few people. All right. Hubot is basically the most important employee at GitHub, I think. We train Hubot to do pretty much everything that we don't want to do. So we deploy through Hubot in our chat app. There's a great talk online by Jesse Newland, one of our ops guys, called Chat Ops, that talks about the way that the ops team uses Hubot. But that's written in CoffeeScript, runs on Node.js. So for the Node.js haters, there is something useful you can do with it. He's also really good at pulling up pictures of cats for Ian. And then we have several Unix utilities, mostly written in C. This is just like some tooling around Git. And there are other parts of the GitHub infrastructure. So one of the first questions people ask us then after seeing that is, well, what about PhoneGap or SL4A or whatever container to write native apps in a non-native language? And we don't really necessarily have anything against that. If I wanted to go build a GitHub app in one of these things, I could. I think there's two reasons primarily that we don't. The first is that the type of people that we hire to work on our native apps are generally people that have already made a name for themselves doing native elsewhere, or at least have some experience. And in that case, they generally did that using whatever the native language is. So Paul, who works on GitHub for Windows, had experience with C#. And same with our Mac apps. These people came from the native background using those tools. So, and the second reason, and this is just me personally, I don't know if everyone at GitHub feels this way, I don't know that I've ever seen a PhoneGap app that I thought looked really good, or at least worked really well. Like, they all feel like a PhoneGap app. So it's important to us to have that native feel, and that's really hard to emulate. So that's not to say it'll always be that way. Hopefully someday tools like PhoneGap or similar things will be as good as a native app. We'll see. It kind of goes to this, it's obvious when things aren't native. I can speak English in France. Some people might be able to understand me, but it'll be obvious that I'm not French. So then what about RubyMotion? Has anyone played with RubyMotion here? A couple of people. Does anyone know what RubyMotion is? Oh, a few more. Well, for those that don't, RubyMotion is you write native iOS apps in Ruby. It compiles down to LLVM, which is what Objective-C compiles down to. and then you can run it on iOS, and it looks exactly like a native app. And again, my reason for this personally is just I don't think that the syntax of the language is the hard part. It's all the other things around it, like learning the APIs, the conventions, stuff like that. So we tend to avoid it. I just made these numbers up. So why Ruby for the rest of it? There's not really a scientific answer to this. The GitHub founders 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago when they started working on it, were writing github.com in Ruby. And I think they tended to attract other people from the Ruby community. Just like this conference, I think, was kind of born out of some Microsoft circles, and it thus attracts people from those circles. So there's not really a good, hard reason why everything has stayed in Ruby. However, one of the kind of core tenets of GitHub is this idea of no parents. We say this a lot whenever we're talking about things, and we mean two things by that. First, we mean that, one, nobody's going to tell you what to do at GitHub. We don't have like managers or bosses or anything. Like if I decide I want to work on a project, I can sell a couple people on it or sell a team and say, let's go do this. We're all really responsive to feedback. If Paul told me, that's a terrible idea, I don't think we should be doing that, I would listen to him because we all have a pretty high level of respect for each other. So along with nobody telling you what to do, the other part of that is then you also have to take responsibility for the decisions that you make. It's like when you first go to college, you're like, wee, my parents can't tell me what to do. Oh, now I'm failing. It's that whole idea of there's two sides to that no parents aspect. So if I decided to write something in Haskell, which is a great language, I then also have to take responsibility for that app and continue to maintain it. Or if I decide to write a native app in PhoneGap, I'm now responsible for it. So I think that in some ways, even though we have this really like loose, chaotic structure, that also adds some stability because everybody kind of takes some personal responsibility. I think, so if you ask me personally, okay, well, why do you prefer Ruby? It's the same as asking me this question, why do you drive a Toyota? And I could probably come up with a bunch of reasons. Paul's talk this morning on how messed up our brains are. I could come up with words to justify why I drive a Toyota. It's reliable, it's dependable, it's stylish if you're 50. And I could come up with just as many reasons to justify Ruby. I really like how expressive it is. I like the dynamic nature of it. It's fun. But I think it comes down to two things. Taste. When I first started learning Ruby, I had also played around with Python, and Python for some reason didn't stick. Like there was just something about Ruby that appealed to me personally. And two, practicality. And what I mean by that, like if we take the car example a little bit farther, so Ruby's not a dump truck. It's not like the internet. You can't just dump things on it. It's not a motorcycle. It's not one of these like specialized vehicles that is good at one specific task and nothing else. Ruby's not going to help you with like a semi haul things across the country. It's a little bit more practical. It's maybe like a little pickup truck or a sedan. Most of us if we own a car, own some type of sedan or a pickup. We're not going to buy a semi or a dump truck. Those are very specialized tools. So Ruby for me is like that. I can write web stuff in it. I could write command line scripts in it. I could build native apps in it if I wanted to. There's just a lot of things I can do with it, and get familiar with the tool set and the libraries around it. So that's why I personally choose Ruby. So then second to last, what libraries do we use? So does anybody, I don't think I've actually asked this, who here uses Ruby in some form? A few people. Who's considering using Ruby? A couple more. All right, so let's look at what libraries we use. In those 342 projects that I looked at, 153 of them had a gem file, which is Ruby's way of declaring your dependencies. It's kind of like NuGet. So I downloaded that gem file and I looked through the declared dependencies. And I couldn't find out a better way to visualize this, so here they are. Obviously, the words that are bigger are the ones that were used in more projects, and vice versa, the ones that were smaller were not used as much. So a few things to look at to draw your attention to. In the middle, we have Sinatra and Rails, which are kind of the two main app frameworks in Ruby. Sinatra is obviously used more. We have a lot of projects that use it, and Rails we still use a lot compared to everything else, but not as much. I'll talk more about those two in a minute. Draw your attention to some databases. We've got MySQL is what GitHub.com runs on, and a lot of other apps. That's technically the one that our ops team is endorsing for the moment, simply because they don't have the bandwidth to support Postgres at a large scale right now, just in terms of their time and managing that. But we have a lot of internal apps that use Postgres. PG is the gem for that. We use Redis in a lot of things. We have a SQLite 3 down there in the bottom. I need to look into this, but my hunch is that those are like prototype apps, or I hope to God they're not used in production. I assure you they're not used on GitHub.com. And then there's two really small ones up there. I don't know if you can see them, but we have Mongo and React are used on a couple projects. And then lastly, test frameworks is another one that people are really curious about. These are all testing libraries. The top right there, you have RSpec and RSpec Rails. We have Minitest in the top and the middle, which is another framework. And then test unit doesn't show up, which is the one built into Ruby. So I'll talk more about those again in a second as well. So there's all of them. So people say, well, Sinatra or Rails. GitHub has this reputation for hating Rails for some reason. The answer is we actually use both quite a bit. We have 51 projects that have Sinatra in them, and we have 30 that use Rails, and 9 that actually use both. So Rails has this way where you can actually mount other app frameworks as part of the same app. And then you can actually use Rails for the things that it does best and Sinatra for the things that it does best. So as I was looking at these, I was curious, we use Sinatra on a lot more projects, but my hunch was that we use Rails for bigger projects. And so again, I looked at these by bytes, and the story changed quite a bit. We have 10 megs of Ruby code in projects that depend on Sinatra. We have 12 megs in Rails, Rails projects, and then 8 that overlap. So again, I didn't look at the 8 that overlap. I didn't see, okay, what's specifically Rails code and what's specifically Sinatra, because that would have been a little bit challenging. But I feel like my hunch was kind of true, that we use Sinatra a lot for really small projects. Then people ask us about testing framework, because that's one of those important questions, like tab versus spaces, because it's going to affect the quality of your code for some reason. We use a little bit, smattering of everything. Test unit is the one that's built into Ruby. 45% of our code is written in test unit, or our tests are written in test unit, I should say. That includes GitHub.com is all test unit. And then we have a bunch of other internal projects that use RSpec and a few that use Minitest. So then lastly, how do we handle major updates? And this is a concern that people have a lot. GitHub deploys constantly. We're always pushing out new features, and hopefully rarely have downtime, at least in terms of deploying features breaking the site. Generally, it's more like DOS attacks. So people are curious how we manage that. And this section applies to pretty much any framework. And so, I encourage you to pay attention here and take this and apply it to whatever you're doing. So we use this concept of feature flags often. Anytime a new feature is deployed on GitHub.com or any of our other properties like Gist, Speaker Deck, Gauges, what we'll do is that feature will actually get deployed days, weeks, maybe even months before the general public sees it. We'll commit it, we'll merge it into master, and we'll push it out, but it'll be turned off for everybody except for staff. And so then we can actually see that feature and interact with it on the live site without it affecting other people. And so how we do that, and this will be a little bit Ruby code, hopefully for those that aren't familiar with Ruby, it makes sense. So we'll have this module called feature flags, which just defines a bunch of conditionals. And so Ruby, we say def, so define a method. Feature flags question mark is a valid method name in Ruby. It's kind of like in Java or JavaScript, you'd say like is preview features. So I have preview features question mark, and it just returns true, whether this person is staff or not. We'll get to where that comes from in a second. Then as I'm adding a new feature, so in this example, let's say I add a time travel feature to my app. It's very sophisticated. I'll basically just say, okay, this feature is enabled if this person gets preview features. We then include that, so Ruby has modules, which are kind of multiple inheritance, but kind of not. You can mix in this behavior. And so I add all of these methods to whatever my user class is. And that's where my staff method comes from. And then this is some Ruby magic, but I basically then expose all of those methods in the module to all my controllers and views. So now everywhere in my app, I can say, is time travel enabled for this person? So what that looks like then, if I go into my view, we'll often have little conditionals like this, where I say, if time travel enabled, like show a link or do something, or vice versa. I could say, if it is, do this, else, give the old behavior. And then in my controller, again, I'll restrict. I'll say, okay, before any of this code runs in the controller, ensure that this person has these preview features. So we do this all the time. And then like on launch day, we simply go into that preview features module and we change whatever the definition was to true. And that's basically what opens it up. So I can't recommend this approach enough. Like if you're maintaining any kind of sizable app with users that are using it every day, commit your stuff in a branch, do your initial development there, but then as soon as possible, get it back into master and get it deployed to production, just turned off by default, so that you can actually start seeing how it interacts with the rest of the app. And we've even done this where, the next slide here, there's a couple libraries in Ruby, I'm sure there's something like this in your language, that allow you to do this dynamically. So we do it in code often. We have a few projects that have started using these. But the cool thing is with Flipper and Rollout is you could say, okay, enable this for 1% of users, or enable this for this group or this company. You can be really selective about how you enable features. It's even cool, like you could start to say, okay, 1%, 5%, 10%. Be like, oh, we're seeing performance issues. You can roll it back down. It just gives you a lot of control as you're rolling out these new features. Managing, so along with deploying new features, there's managing the upgrade for major Ruby versions. It's been a couple years, or maybe a year and a half now. Ruby 1.9 came out, and forever nobody upgraded to it. Everybody still used Ruby 1.8, and it was quite a painful upgrade process. So people ask us, well, how did you manage that upgrade? We just recently deployed to Ruby 1.9. Ruby 2.0 came out in February. I think if we didn't do it this last week, I think we're moving soon to Ruby 2.0. I don't know the schedule for that. And again, I think this probably applies to any language, but basically all we did was we started running our tests against both versions of Ruby. In Ruby, we had, Ruby 1.9 has the advantage that it's somewhat backward compatible with Ruby 1.8. So we started running the tests, some magic happened, and then all of a sudden we deployed to production. No, that magic was TMM1, Aman Gupta that works at GitHub. He spent a long time, like 6 months or more, working on this upgrade. But basically what he would do is he'd look at the test failures, fix a couple of them, merge that back into master, make sure that it works against Ruby 1.8 and 1.9, deploy that to production. And he'd do the same thing again. Look at one of the test failures or a certain group of test failures, fix it in a branch, test it, make sure it works against both, merge it into master, deploy it to production. So the nice thing was we never had any major changes that threatened to bring down GitHub.com. It's important to take these really small incremental steps. And the path to GitHub 2.0 is actually the same. We now run our tests against all 3 versions. We'll be dropping Ruby 1.8 soon because we're getting close to the point of not having anything on 1.8. But anyway, run your tests against all of them, fix one of the issues, get it deployed to production as soon as possible. We saw some performance boosts. The average CPU response time went down by 25 milliseconds. there's the graph for it. You can see when we deployed it, it dropped down, and then immediately after, there was actually a big spike. We hit a GC bug in Ruby that we had to fix, and then things were fine. So, but again, the nice thing is we were trying to constantly get these things into production as soon as possible so that we know the effect that all of these small changes have. So Rails 3 is a little bit harder. We're still on Rails 2.3, which if you know anything about the Rails releases, 3 was a really big upgrade. And unfortunately, it's a lot harder than Ruby. We can't run our app, we can't run github.com against both versions. And so that's been a little bit of a painful process. We have a fork of Rails that we maintain. We're trying to backport some things from Rails 3 into that. And then everything else again, Aman Gupta is working on backporting the API changes for Rails 3 into Rails 2, so that as far as our code's concern is, with interacting with the framework, they look identical, but it's actually still Rails 2 versus Rails 3. So it's a little bit of a painful process. But now I want to open it up. Any questions that you guys have? We've got about 10 minutes for questions. It can be Ruby related or GitHub related.
The DDoS. Oh, hang on. Yep.
One sec.
Hang on.
We'll get the mic. Let's start up here in red.
How's the experience been with the DDoS side as GitHub's been more and more popular? And what have you learned on that side?
Yeah, so I haven't really been involved with the ops team, but I've kind of observed like a fly on the wall. It just seems like a really hard problem. So we've had I think you guys all heard the question, DDoS issues. Yes, it's kind of like fighting spam. Like you figure out like one attack vector, you fix that, it's fine for a few weeks or a few days or a few weeks, and then another one comes along. So I know one issue or one challenge with that is we're kind of limited right now in the data center that we're in terms of what we can do, like just physically like what we can do with that and how we can change the infrastructure. So we're trying to figure out problems to that or solutions to that. But yeah, I don't know if there's a easy solution at least to that issue.
So the code that you put in place for new features, do you look to actually leave that code in place long term? So if there's a problem with that feature, you can switch it out again?
Usually once we deploy it, it might be days, might be weeks later, we pull it out. It really depends on the feature. Some of them, like, let me just think of an example. I don't know if I can think of one off the top of my head. Like there's a couple that instead of being feature flags, they actually turn into, just runtime dependency issues. So we write a new feature that depends on React, and that's the first dependency we have on that. Instead of being a feature flag like, is this thing enabled, it becomes, is React available? Or something like that, where we're able to shut off certain parts of the system if services fail. But in terms of like how long we spend developing, and I know this wasn't exactly your question, but we've had feature flags that have been around in the code for maybe 6 months. Like when we pushed out, I worked on the new notification stuff that went out like 6 months ago, and that was actually like a 9-month long project. And what happened was we spent a few months working on it, thought we were getting close to something that we liked. We merged into master with feature flags, started using it internally. And it turned out like everybody was ticked off. Like people were yelling at us like the new notifications are horrible. I want the old stuff back. And so we spent like probably 3 to 6 months polishing, changing the way that it worked because we realized once we had it in production that we didn't like it. So, all right.
You talk about the whole no parents philosophy. How does that work for someone who just starts at GitHub? Like they get there, no one tells them what to do. What do they start doing?
Yeah. So that's gotten better. Like my first day a year and a half ago was really funny because I joined with this whole team of 5 of us, and we were in U.S. Eastern Time. GitHub headquarters is Pacific Time, so we all got together. We didn't fly out to headquarters for some reason. Most people do their first week, but so we were all in Eastern Time zone. We wake up, And it's like Monday morning, like our first day at GitHub, and nobody's online yet. So like we just kind of hung out until like 2 o'clock in the afternoon when people finally got online Pacific time. And they gave us our chat credentials, and they're like, welcome to GitHub. And so first week it was like, all right, well, what are we supposed to do here? So that's gotten better now. Like we have, every new hire has a buddy when they come in. So there's like one person that's in charge of just making sure they know what's going on, they figure out the ropes. And then we kind of have like an orientation day. The first day is, here's your new laptop. Boxin, which I mentioned, is our tool for setting that up. And now that only takes like 20 minutes. So they'll run Boxin, they'll get all their development dependencies installed, do some HR stuff. But really then the first week, their biggest goal is to ship something. So that's kind of what we ask everybody. Like, it doesn't have to be a huge feature, but figure out something that you don't like on github.com or whatever the product is you're going to be working on, and figure out how to ship it. And the buddy helps with that. They kind of, help you figure out what to work on, or help you figure out who to talk to figure, to discover what you need to do to ship that. So, good question. Yeah.
You mentioned about the internal reaction to your new notifications system. How do you? Can you tell us a little bit about some stories, or how do you manage external reactions to changes to something that people use every day, like GitHub?
Yeah. So I think we have the advantage, I guess you would say, of we're probably the biggest users of GitHub.com internally, in terms of like we use it every day to build it. So it's pretty, we have some pretty strong feelings about what's wrong with it. I mean, for everything that you don't like about GitHub, I could probably tell you 10 more things that I can't stand. So I think in that regard, like a lot of times we're driven by our own desires to see it better. But we're also to the point now where we kind of have, what do they call it, the curse of knowledge, where it's like we're all also now expert users at GitHub, and nobody else is, or very few people are. So that's something we're trying to figure out, like what does it look like for people that don't know what GitHub is to start using it. And we're having to listen to more feedback. We take support really seriously. So if 10 people in a day say, hey, I can't figure out how to do this, it kind of works its way into the development workflow, and somebody tries to tackle, okay, how do we make that easier? I think the hardest thing, or at least for me so far, internally, my coworkers are really the biggest critics. Like when we launched the notification stuff, there was some people that didn't love it, and I'll be the first to admit it's far from perfect. But it was brutal internally, because like we have pretty high standards of how things should work, and so we launched it internally, and I don't know, I was ready to hide in a cave for a couple of months because people were so upset about it, and that's kind of really what drives us. So.
Brendan, just following on from those last couple of things, you've talked about going to prod and shipping quickly. What sort of QA process, if any, do you guys follow?
We don't have anything formal. It's everybody kind of ships their own features. So, like for example, on GitHub.com, I'm not on the GitHub.com team anymore, and so if I want to ship something, I essentially do what like the open source workflow. I go fork it to my own account, make changes, I send a pull request, somebody on the GitHub.com team will kind of review it, test it out, but then it's up to you to make sure that the quality is there. We'll deploy it. We have a couple internal app servers that you can deploy to first, to really test things out. But other than that, we just, whenever everybody on the team gives you a thumbs up, you're like, all right, deploy it to production. We'll find out pretty quickly if it's broken. So, yeah, we don't have really a formal process, though. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Mike, back there.
You can be next. With regard to the feature flipping side of things, how do you guys deal with changes in data models which are going to be running concurrently? So do you have to write more code which sort of synchronizes between the two data models?
Yeah, that's a hard problem. We generally try to, so like adding new fields is always really easy. Like anytime you're adding a new table or new columns to a table, like that's not generally a problem. The challenge is when you want to like rename things or delete fields. The notification stuff. Yeah, so like notifications, we actually just wrote an entirely new backend for it. Like the old one was, I don't even remember how it was structured. But the new one, we kind of moved it out almost to a separate service. Like it was still in the github.com code base, but it was separate database tables and everything. And then just, I think the first time you pull up the new notifications interface, we like copied over your settings. I don't actually remember exactly how that worked. But we did have a lot of like duplicate code running where either we're writing the two tables or when this thing up here updates, also update that over there. So it's a little bit more work, but I don't know any other way to do it. So
That's so cool. Thank you very much indeed. Everybody, please join me in thanking Brandon Keepers from GitHub.
thanks.